Hi everyone, it's Hannah A, and welcome to Storytime for tonight. I hope you guys had an awesome day at Alculana Online. I know we had a bunch of really cool stuff planned, so I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm really glad that you're here joining us tonight for the next few chapters of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I know for me, I love these times because it's a time where I get to just relax, stop thinking about things, and listen to the story. So I hope it can be the same kind of thing for you. Go ahead and get comfortable, get in your favorite pajamas or like your big sweatshirt, whatever you want to do. Grab a snack if you want to, and we'll just go ahead and get started right where you guys left off. So starting with chapter 16, titled The Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas, everyone said at once. Oompa Loompas! Imported direct from Loompaland, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but... Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. Salt. I'm a teacher of geography. Then you'll know all about it, said Mr. Wonka. And oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beasts in the world. Hornswogglers and snozzwangers and those terrible, wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle could eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the wangdoodles and the hornswogglers and the snozzwangers. And they were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting. And the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing up the treetops looking for other things to mash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves and bark from the bung bung tree, all of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. The one food that they longed for more than any other was the cacao bean. But they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cacao beans all year. But oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about the cacao beans all night and talk about them all day. You had only mentioned the word cacao to an Oompa Loompa and he would start dribbling at the mouth. The cacao bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cacao tree, happens to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cacao bean, and the cacao bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cacao beans every week in this factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy about this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompish. Look here, if you and all your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cacao beans you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have cacao beans for every meal. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cacao beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. Of course I mean it, I said. And you have chocolate as well? Chocolate tastes even better than cacao beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal, he cried. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. I must warn you though, they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deerskins. The The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy, get me an Oompa Loompa. Now, my pet, her father said to her, we mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa, screamed Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right. But I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see that you have one before the day is out. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you had better do that. Augustus, you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling on the riverbank, scooping hot, melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Now we are on to chapter 17, and the title of this chapter is Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please, I beg of you do not do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." Augustus, called out Mrs. Gloop, didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from that river at once. This stuff is fabulous, said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. Gosh, I need a bucket to drink it properly. Augustus, cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waggling his stick in the air. You must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate. Augustus, cried Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground, with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop, you'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country. Be careful, Augustus, shouted Mr. Gloop. You're leaning out too far. Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek, and then a splash, and then into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. Save him, screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face, waving her umbrella about. He'll drown. He can't swim a yard. Save him. Save him. Good heavens, woman, cried Mr. Gloop. I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on. Augustus Gloop's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. Help, 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 he yelled. Fish me out. Don't just stand there, Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. Do something. I am doing something, said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer to the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once, the powerful suction took a hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. There he goes, somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first, like a torpedo. Help! Murder! Police! Screamed Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, come back at once! Where are you going? It's a wonder to me, said Mr. Gloop, how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it. It isn't big enough, said Charlie Bucket. Oh dear, look, he's slowing down. Oh, he is, said Grandpa Joe. He's going to get stick, said Charlie. I think he is, said Grandpa Joe. By golly, he has stuck, said Charlie. His mouth, his stomach, that's done it, said Mr. Gloop. He's blocked the whole pipe, said Grandpa Joe. Smash the pipe, yelled Mrs. Gloop, waving her umbrella. Augustus, come out of there at once. The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that something was Augustus. Woof! Up he shot again, like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. He's disappeared, yelled Mrs. Gloop. Where does that pipe go to? Quick, call the fire brigade. "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." How can he possibly come out of it just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. "Impossible," cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable, inconceivable, absurd. He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, may I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because that pipe doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make the most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge." "Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge?" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "My poor Augustus, they'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mrs. Gloop. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Gloop. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Gloop. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's just gone up a pipe? You're a monster," she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. "You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one great big colossal joke." "He'll be perfectly safe," said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. "He'll be chocolate fudge," shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Never!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Of course he will," shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "I wouldn't allow it," cried Mr. Wonka. "And why not?" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Because the taste would be terrible," said Mr. Wonka. "Just imagine it, Augustus-flavored chocolate-coated Gloop? No one would buy it." "They most certainly would," cried Mr. Gloop indignantly. "I don't want to think about it," shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Nor do I," said Mr. Wonka. "And I do promise you, madame, that your darling boy is perfectly safe." "If he's perfectly safe, then where is he?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "Lead me to him this instant." Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharply. Click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and then stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy. His hair was long and golden brown, and the top of his head came just about the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. "Now listen to me," said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. "I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them to find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe." The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into pearls of laughter. "Oh, do be quiet," said Mr. Wonka. "Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think it's funny at all." "You can say that again," said Mrs. Gloop. "Go straight to the fudge room," Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, "and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain that you'll find him there. But you'd better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, he's liable to get poured into the fudge boiler, and that really would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite uneatable." Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. "I'm joking," said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. "I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye. I'll see you later." And as Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. "Augustus Gloop," they chanted. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop." "Grandpa," cried Charlie. "Listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing?" "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe. "I think they're going to sing us a song." "Augustus Gloop," chanted the Oompa Loompas. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. However long this pig might live, we're positive he'd never give. even the smallest bit of fun or happiness to anyone. So what we do in cases such as this, we use the gentle touch, and carefully we take the brat and turn him into something that will give great pleasure to us all. A doll, for instance, or a ball, or marbles, or a rocking horse. But this revolting boy, of course, was so vile, so greedy, foul, and infantile, that he left a most disgusting taste inside our mouths, and so in haste we choose the thing, come what may, would take the nasty taste away. Come on, we cried, the time is right to send him shooting up the pipe. He has to go, it has to be, and very soon he's going to see, inside the room to which he's gone, some funny things are going on. But don't, dear children, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed, although, of course, we must admit he will be altered quite a bit. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. Slowly the wheels will go round and round, the cogs begin to grind and pound, 100 knives go slice, 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 we add some sugar, cream, and spice, we boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and all the gall is boiled away once for all, and then when he comes out, and now by grace a miracle has taken place, this boy who only just before was loathed by men from shore to shore, this greedy brute, this louse's ear, is loved by people everywhere, for who could hate or bear a grudge against a luscious bit of fudge? I told you they love to sing, cried Mr. Wonka. Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they say. It's all nonsense, every bit of it. Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa? Asked Charlie. Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa. They must be joking. At least, I hope they're joking. Don't you? Alrighty, chapter 18. This one is called Down the Chocolate River. Off we go, cried Mr. Wonka. Hurry up, everybody. Follow me to the next room, and please don't worry about Augustus Gloop. He is bound to come out in the wash. They always do. We shall have to make the next part of this journey by boat. Here she comes. Look. A steady mist was rising up now from the great warm chocolate river, and out of the mist there appeared suddenly a most fantastic pink boat. It was a large open rowboat with a tall front and a tall back, like a Viking boat of old. And it was such a shining, sparkling, glistening pink color that the whole thing looked as though it were made of bright pink glass. There were many oars on either side of it, and as the boat came closer, the watchers on the river bank could see that the oars were being pulled by masses of Oompa Loompas, at least 10 of them to each oar. This is my private yacht, cried Mr. Wonka, beaming with pleasure. I made her by hollowing out an enormous boiled sweet. Isn't she beautiful? See how she comes cutting through the river? The gleaming pink boiled sweet boat glided up the riverbank. 100 Oompa Loompas rested on their oars and stared up at the visitors. Then suddenly, for some reason best known to themselves, they all burst into shrieks of laughter. What's so funny? Asked Violet. Oh, don't worry about them, cried Mr. Wonka. They're always laughing. They think everything's a colossal joke. Jump into the boat, all of you. Come on, hurry up. As soon as everyone was safely in, the Oompa Loompas pushed the boat away from the bank and began to row swiftly down the river. Hey there, Mike, shouted Mr. Wonka. Please do not lick the boat with your tongue. It only makes it sticky. Daddy, said Veruca Salt, I want a boat like this. I want you to buy me a big pink boiled sweet boat exactly like Mr. Wonka's. And I want lots of Oompa Loompas to row me about. And I want a chocolate river. And I want. She wants a good kick in the pants, whispered Grandpa Joe to Charlie. The old man was sitting in the back of the boat, and little Charlie Bucket was right next to him. Charlie was holding tightly onto his grandfather's bony old hand. He was in a whirl of excitement. Everything that he had seen so far, the great chocolate river, the waterfall, the huge sucking pipes, the minty sugar meadows, the Oompa Loompas, the beautiful pink boat, and most of all, Mr. Willy Wonka himself, had been so astonishing that he began to wonder whether there could possibly be any more astonishments left. Where are they going now? What were they going to see? And then what in the world was going to happen in the next room? "Isn't it marvelous?" said Grandpa Joe, grinning at Charlie. Charlie nodded and smiled up at the old man. Suddenly, Mr. Wonka, who was sitting on Charlie's other side, reached down into the bottom of the boat and picked up a large mug, dipped it into the river, and filled it with chocolate and handed it to Charlie. "Drink this," he said. "It'll do you good. You look starved to death." Then Mr. Wonka filled a second mug and gave it to Grandpa Joe. "You too," he said. "You look like a skeleton. What's the matter? Hasn't there been anything to eat in your house lately?" "Not much," said Grandpa Joe. Charlie put the mug to his lips, and as the rich, warm, creamy chocolate ran down his throat into his empty tummy, his whole body from head to toe began to tingle with pleasure, and a feeling of intense happiness spread over him. "You like it?" asked Mr. Wonka. "Oh, it's wonderful," Charlie said. "The creamiest, loveliest chocolate I've ever tasted," said Grandpa Joe, smacking his lips. "That's because it's been mixed by waterfall," Mr. Wonka told him. The boat sped on down the river. The river was getting narrower. There was some kind of dark tunnel ahead, a great round tunnel that looked like an enormous pipe. And the river was running right into the tunnel, and so was the boat. "Row on," shouted Mr. Wonka, jumping up and waving his stick in the air. "Full speed ahead." And with the Oompa Loompas rowing faster than ever, the boat shot into the pitch-dark tunnel, and all the passengers screamed with excitement. "How can they see where they're going?" shrieked Violet in the darkness. "There's no knowing where they're going," cried Mr. Wonka, hooting with laughter. "There's no earthly way of knowing which direction they are going. There's no knowing where they're rowing or which way the river's flowing. Not a speck of light is showing, so the danger must be growing, for rowers keep rowing, and they're certainly not showing any signs that they are slowing." "He's gone off his rocker," shouted one of the fathers, and the other parents joined in the chorus of frightened shouting. "He's crazy," they shouted. "He's gloomy, he's nutty, he's screwy, he's batty, he's dippy, he's dotty, he's daffy, he's goofy, he's beany, he's buggy, he's wacky, he's loony." "No, he's not," cried Grandpa Joe. "Switch on the light," shouted Mr. Wonka, and suddenly on came the lights, and the whole tunnel was brilliantly lit up, and Charlie could see that they were indeed inside a gigantic pipe. And the great upward curving of the walls of the pipe were pure white and spotlessly clean. The river of the chocolate was flowing very fast inside the pipe, and the Oompa Loompas were all rowing like mad, and the boat was rocketing along at a furious pace. Mr. Wonka was jumping up and down in the back of the boat, calling to the rowers to row faster and faster still. He seemed to love the sensation of whizzing through the white tunnel in a pink boat on a chocolate river, and he clapped his hands and laughed and kept glancing at the passengers to see if they were enjoying it as much as he was. "Look, Grandpa," cried Charlie, "there's a door in the wall. It was a green door, and it was set into the wall of the tunnel just above the level of the river." As they flashed past it, there was just enough time to read the writing on the door. "Storeroom, number 54, it said. "All the creams, dairy cream, whipped cream, violet cream, coffee cream, pineapple cream, vanilla cream, and hair cream." "Hair cream?" cried Mike. "You don't use hair cream." "Row on," shouted Mr. Wonka. "There's no time to answer silly questions." They streaked past a black door, "Storeroom, number 71. And it said on it, "Whips, all shapes and sizes." "Whips?" cried Veruca Salt. "What on earth do you use whips for?" "For whipping cream, of course," cried Mr. Wonka. "How can you whip cream without whips? Whipping cream isn't whipped cream at all unless it's been whipped with whips, just as a poached egg isn't a poached egg unless it's been stolen from the woods in the dead of night. Row on, please." They all passed a yellow door which said, "Storeroom 77. The beans, cacao beans, coffee beans, jelly beans, and has-beens. "Has-beens?" cried Violet. "You're one yourself," said Mr. Wonka. "There's no time for arguing. Press on, press on." But 5 seconds later, when a bright red door came into sight, He suddenly waved his gold-topped cane in the air and shouted, "Stop the boat!" Chapter 19, The Inventing Room, Everlasting Gobstoppers, and Hair Toffee. When Mr. Wonka shouted, "Stop the boat," the Oompa Loompas jammed their oars into the river and backed water furiously. The boat stopped. The Oompa Loompas guided the boat alongside the red door. The door, it said, "Inventing Room, Private, Keep Out." Mr. Wonka took a key from his pocket, leaned over the side of the boat, and put the key in the keyhole. "This is the most important room in the entire factory," he said. "All my most secret new inventions are cooking and simmering in here. Old Ficklegrubber would give his front teeth to be allowed inside just for 3 minutes. So would Prosnose and Slugworth and all the other rotten chocolate makers. But now, listen to me. I want no messing about when you go in. No touching, no meddling, and no tasting. Is that agreed?" "Yes, yes," the children cried. "We won't touch a thing." "Up to now," Mr. Wonka said, "nobody else, not even an Oompa Loompa, has ever been allowed in here." He opened the door and stepped out of the boat into the room. The 4 children and their parents all scrambled after him. "Don't touch," shouted Mr. Wonka, "and don't knock anything over." Charlie Bucket stared around the gigantic room in which he found himself. The place was like a witch's kitchen. All about him, black metal pots were boiling and bubbling on huge stoves, and kettles were hissing, and pans were sizzling, and strange iron machines were clanking and sputtering, and there were pipes running all over the ceilings and walls, and the whole place was filled with smoke and steam and delicious, rich smells. Mr. Wonka himself had suddenly become even more excited than usual, and anyone could see that this was the room he loved best of all. He was hopping about among the saucepans and the machines like a child among his Christmas presents, not knowing which thing to look at first. He lifted the lid from a huge pot and took a sniff. Then he rushed over and dipped his finger into a barrel of sticky yellow stuff and had a taste. And then he skipped across to one of the machines and turned half a dozen knobs this way and that. Then he peered anxiously through the glass door of the gigantic oven, rubbing his hands and cackling with delight at what he saw inside. Then he ran over to another machine, a small, shiny affair that kept going put, 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 put. And every time it went put, a large green marble dropped out of it into the basket on the floor. At least it looked like a marble. "Everlasting Gobstoppers!" cried Mr. Wonka proudly. "They're completely new. I am inventing them for children who are given very little pocket money. You can put an everlasting gobstopper in your mouth and you can suck it and suck it and suck it and suck it, and it will never get any smaller." "It's like gum!" cried Violet Beauregard. "It's not like gum," cried Mr. Wonka. "Gum is for chewing, and if you tried chewing one of these gobstoppers here, you'd break your teeth off. And they never get smaller, and they never disappear, never. At least I don't think they do. There's one of them being tested at this very moment in the testing room next door. An Oompa Loompa is sucking it. He's been sucking it for nearly a year now without stopping, and is still just as good as ever. Now, over here," Mr. Wonka went on, skipping excitedly across the room to the opposite wall. "Over here, I'm inventing a completely new line of toffees." He stopped beside a large saucepan. The saucepan was full of thick, gooey, purplish treacle boiling with bubbles. By standing on his toes, little Charlie could just see inside it. "That's hair toffee?" cried Mr. Wonka. "You eat just one tiny bit of that, and in exactly half an hour a brand new, luscious, thick, silky, beautiful crop of hair will start growing out all on the top of your head, and a mustache and a beard." "A beard?" cried Veruca Salt. "Who wants a beard, for heaven's sake?" "It would suit you very well," said Mr. Wonka, "but unfortunately the mixture is not quite right yet. I have got it too strong. It works too well. I tried it on an Oompa Loompa yesterday in the testing room, and immediately a huge black beard started shooting out of his chin. The beard grew so fast that soon it was trailing all over the floor in a thick, hairy carpet. It was growing faster than we could cut it, and in the end we had to use a lawnmower to keep it in check. But I'll get the mixture right soon, and when I do, then there'll be no excuse for any more little boys or girls going about with bald heads. But Mr. Wonka, said Mike TV, little boys and little girls never go about with. Don't argue, my dear child. Please don't argue, cried Mr. Wonka. It's such a waste of precious time. Now, over here, you will all step this way, and I will show you something that I'm terrifically proud of. Oh, do be careful. Don't knock anything over. Stand back. On to chapter 20. And this chapter is titled The Great Gum Machine. Mr. Wonka led the party over to a gigantic machine that stood in the very center of the inventing room. It was a mountain of gleaming metal that towered high above the children and their parents. Out of the very top of it, there sprouted hundreds and hundreds of thin glass tubes, and the glass tubes all curled downwards and came together in a bunch and hung suspended over an enormous round tub as big as a bath. Here we go, cried Mr. Wonka. And he pressed 3 different buttons on the side of the machine. A second later, a mighty rumbling sound came from inside it, and the whole machine began to shake. Most frighteningly, the steam began hissing out of it all over, and suddenly the watchers noticed that runny stuff was pouring down the sides of all the hundreds of little glass tubes and squirting out into the great tub below. And in every single tube, the runny stuff was a different color, so that all the colors of the rainbow, and many others as well, came sloshing and splashing into the tub. It was a lovely sight, and when the tub was nearly full, Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and immediately the runny stuff disappeared, and a whizzing, whirling noise took its place. And then a giant whizzer started whizzing round inside the enormous tub, mixing up all the different colored liquids like an ice cream soda. Gradually, the mixture began to froth. It became frothier and frothier, and it turned from blue to white to green to brown to yellow, and then back to blue again. Watch, said Mr. Wonka. Click went the machine, and the whizzer stopped whizzing, and now there came a sort of sucking noise, and very quickly all of the blue frothy mixture in the huge basin was sucked back into the stomach of the machine. There was a moment of silence, then a few queer rumblings were heard, then silence again, then suddenly the machine let out a monstrous, mighty groan, and at the same moment a tiny drawer, no bigger than the drawer in a slot machine, popped out of the side of the machine, and in the drawer there lay something so small and thin and gray that everyone thought it must be a mistake. The thing looked like a little strip of gray cardboard. The children and their parents stared at the little gray strip lying in the drawer. You mean that's all? Said Mike TV, disgusted. That's all? Answered Mr. Wonka, gazing proudly at the result. Don't you know what it is? There was a pause. Then suddenly, Violet Beauregard, the silly, gum-chewing girl, let out a yell of excitement. By gum, it's gum, she shrieked. It's a stick of chewing gum. Right you are, cried Mr. Wonka, slapping Violet hard on the back. It's a stick of gum. It's a stick of the most amazing and fabulous and sensational gum in the world. Alrighty, everyone, that is where we're stopping the story tonight. So make sure you tune in to our next story time. You can find it on our schedule, where you'll hear the next chapter, chapter 21, titled Goodbye, Violet. So it should be a pretty interesting one. I'm really glad that you guys stuck with me and got to listen to the story. I hope that it helped you relax and get comfortable and just chill out for the night. I know it helped me to kind of calm my worries and just get ready to snuggle into bed, so I hope it did the same for you all, and I hope you guys have a good night. I'm praying for all of you, and I really have loved getting to see you every day, so I hope that you guys tune in tomorrow for Aculana Online, and hopefully I'll see you there. Have a good day, everyone. Bye. Good night.